Train Lord. The first day of train school, our teacher asked us what we would do if we were on the train and we had to go to the toilet and we'd already had our break. For a while, no one spoke. Then Susie said, "Shit in a bag, sir." Yeah, probably shit in a bag. Oh, tough crowd. Good on you, Suze, our teacher said. The shit in a bag approach, a classic. Then we went around the room and said our names and where we'd come from and a fun fact about us too. Ed said he'd worked in logistics and sailed around the world with the Navy in his youth. And Zaid had been a transit cop with a baby on the way. But now it was my turn and I did not know what to say. I did not want to talk about the migraine or how I'd failed as a writer. I did not want to talk about pain. So I said my name was Oliver and flipped my wrist fry pan style. I winked and said that I loved to cook.
Thank you. It's a bold way to start. It really immerses the reader in train school, which is a recurring theme, kind of through line throughout the book. I wanted to start here too because you kind of point us to two important pieces of background to this story. One is that before you wrote this book, before you had this migraine that we'll talk about, you were a writer. And so let's start there. Tell us about your kind of nascent career as a writer. And also I wanted to ask you about this because we'll talk about the migraine, but it's not as if the migraine came out of totally nowhere. So in the book, you say of previous pain, I ignored the panic attacks, early headaches, sleepless nights. These were signs. They were saying, stop writing, you dumb fucking fuck. So what was your writing career like before the migraine? It's pretty intense.
I mean, there's a bit of swearing, but it's also, I hope, quite literary in a way. Yeah, basically, like, I ended up getting into a creative writing school in Melbourne. Up until that point, I'd kind of drifted around doing, studying Spanish for a year, studying business, journalism. And I did not know what I wanted to do, but I knew I always wanted to write. So I said, if I get into this writing school, then I'm going to move to Melbourne. I'm going to commit to being a writer. And I was lucky enough to get, in Australia, you get on Centrelink. It's like government allowance if you're at university. And most people would just kind of say, all right, well, I can just, live a university kind of lifestyle. But I went a bit more extreme and I kind of said, this is the only time in my life I'm going to get paid to be a writer. And so if I don't have a book finished by the time university's done, then I've failed, which is a really, in hindsight, extreme thing to say. But at the time, it kind of made sense because I knew I had a regime, I guess. I would write 1,000 words a day, every day. And I was going to do that for 3 years. And I did it. But I suppose, yeah, like you said in that quote, certain things kind of started happening. I remember during one of my final assignments, I had like the first of these kind of migraines come on, and I was trying to finish this assignment and I ended up having to close. It was always looking at screens for some reason that really it really affected me. And I remember basically closing my eyes and trying to type like this assignment, doing that, knowing as well that I had a book that was almost finished but not finished, and also knowing that in this kind of world that was growing and becoming very technological, that this thing, if you can't interact with it, if you can't do it, ostracizes you and becomes quite terrifying. And I guess with that, that only lasted sort of maybe 24 hours or something like that, but it was a very early sign that perhaps my relationship to, not only to literature, but my sense of self-worth coming from writing exclusively, not able to separate myself from the art, not looking at art as something tangible, but something very, there was no division. And so if the writing failed, or if I wasn't able to produce in a way that I wanted, it meant I failed. And that was something that, I guess, to tie in the American Library in Paris, growing up in America, which I did. I grew up in Texas from when I was 9 to 15, and it was very much, be all you can be. And like, we had on our classroom wall, we had a poster that said, American ends in I can. I thought it did, but I suppose at that point I wasn't mature enough to be able to understand my relationship to art.
And also, so you mentioned you had this early 24-hour period of extreme pain and migraine. Tell us how that then evolved to something that lasted 10 months. Because what's so beautiful about this book, I mean, there are many beautiful descriptions, but I think I had never really encountered such striking and haunting descriptions of pain, and specifically chronic pain. So tell us about that experience and how you ultimately discovered ways to write about it.
Yeah, I think I would start by saying, first of all, like I never knew how to tell someone that you've had a 10-month migraine, and by extension, I guess a lot of people who have suffered chronic pain, which is a very invisible thing to have. I never knew how I would quite go about it, because I didn't want to hurt the reader, but I wanted to honor my story. And I wanted to write the book basically for the millions of other people. I didn't get chronic pain before I had suffered these things, and I just thought you just get on with it. But having been utterly debilitated by it, for me, I wanted to produce a text that basically took the reader as close as they could to the story, like they were almost going to sit on your shoulder. And so, and I'll get to the middle part, but essentially with this book, I sort of viewed the central migraine as almost like a sun, and each chapter and the stories within that would be planets oscillating around it. And each one of those planets would be wrapped in glass, but that glass would be smashed. So the reflections going back to the central theme of the migraine would not completely hit the thing, because that's the tragedy and beauty of art, is that you can never fully express probably the translation from the brain to the page or to the canvas. There's always going to be a disconnect. But I knew if I could do it enough from many different sides of this thing, then I would create a sort of composite sketch, which would be close, I suppose. But I guess to answer your, that was another thing, but I guess to, answer your question around, like what happened, I think, those things that I was saying with my first book, which is about growing up in America, and about being young in Melbourne. And I guess I was part of a writer's scene, which I'm very distant from now, and actually have no real interest in writing about the internet. But it was a young book I wrote at 25. I never had any mentors. I was really just trying to, I thought if I published enough short stories, and then if I got a book done, then money would start flowing, and doors would keep unlocking. And I guess the reality was, at least for me, that like nothing changed, which is a huge reality for many writers. You publish a book and you think something gargantuan and life affirming and changing is going to happen, and the reality is 20 people read it and but you've honored something intrinsic within yourself. That's the mature Oliver talking. The younger Oliver didn't understand that. And so I think these ideas of failure, coupled with when you do write what might be called autofiction or memoir, is that at least then I wasn't able to separate myself from the prose. And so it got reviewed quite widely, and it got reviewed well in many cases, but there were definitely people who just hated it. And so being at that, I was quite, I mean, I was also like, had a bit of a party boy lifestyle. I was probably not living the healthiest way. I was probably taking, I was drinking a lot and partying, let's say. And so I wasn't able to, be mature enough to say, okay, you might not like this text, but that doesn't affect me. And if you want to get super Freud on it, perhaps like returning to maybe my childhood in America, which largely I would say I didn't understand the culture so much, and coming from Australia, and I didn't understand that very driven, quite capitalistic, quite intense pursuit of excellence, even though that's what I was trying to do anyway. And so I would say in hindsight, I developed certain things that were to do with a fear of failure. And then when that reality hit, perhaps my ego wasn't strong enough to absorb that, and my body and brain just shut down, because the hurt, which was probably coming back from childhood, wasn't able to it was, yeah, like you said, it was like, stop writing, you dumb fucking fuck. Like, this is something that you're not A, mature enough yet to do, and B, it's causing, yeah, you too much pain. And so essentially what happened was, one day after Lion Attack came out, and I was trying to do a grant for the grant that eventually took me to Georgia, funnily enough. But I was pitching my next book and trying to do it, and then I just felt sort of like my head veins sort of start sticking out, and then something in my head just sort of, it felt like a rubber band being pulled and pushed and pulled and pushed, and eventually it was like something snapped, and there was like an audible like, and I remember like I collapsed to the ground and my vision just went completely blank, and I ended up, it sounds absurdly cinematic, but I remember like army crawling outside because I knew I had to vomit, and going to the park and just vomiting, and then I couldn't move. I was just in the park and I couldn't move. And then that migraine lasted 10 months, basically. Yeah.
I wanted to read a few descriptions of this, that there are many, as you say. We'll talk about the form because it's fascinating. But you write, then I suffered a 10-month long migraine or a tension headache, or I had a breakdown. I don't know. For 10 months, in any case, the pain was constant, exacerbated by writing, reading, using computers, everything that you wanted to be doing, looking at phones or anything with a screen. You write, people always think the pain is what breaks you, but it isn't. It's the boredom. I spent a lot of time lying in bed thinking about all the stories I wanted to tell but could not tell and did not know why. I would lie there in a sort of catatonic panic with my eyes closed, trying to remember what I had started calling the before. Finally, you say, pain, although especially chronic pain, has a way of unhinging you. Life as you know it evaporates, and what remains resembles a joke or a cruel magician's trick.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, you know, and again, like, it's quite a funny book. Like, despite everything, I think for me, what was most important was actually the American writer Scott McClanahan says this. He basically says, you know, like, a lot of writers will try and go to these bleak places because that's hopefully where you can mine something quite interesting from your life. But what they fail to do is recognize the humor and the absurdity in these situations. And if you ignore that, because even in death, even in war, in chronic pain, there's a lot of humor and misunderstanding. And for me, it was really important because I knew if I could make someone laugh, you know, like, to write a book, you've got like one purpose, right? You want people to keep turning pages, and there are many ways to do that. And the Australian comedian Hannah Gatsby, you know, breaks down how a joke works, and it's all about creating tension and releasing, and creating tension and releasing. And similarly in this book, I knew that I was going to be going from polarities of humor to not depravity, but call it darkness. And to again to and what Scott McClanahan says is like, if you, he's from West Virginia, he's like, you can make people laugh, man, like you can go to the most fucked up places you ever been and they will go with you. And it's kind of true. It is true. Because otherwise, if you just like, if I just presented this book of like my sob story about I had a migraine, there's too much hurt and pain in this world already. Like, I have no interest in presenting just a straight up, admittedly dull story about pain. It's like, I want people to feel and understand not necessarily what I went through, yeah, but hopefully if I've done this book right and I do the stories right, it's like you go into your own stories and into your own mind and your own relationships, and there's every chance, you know, like, I mean, even since COVID, the amount of people that are suffering chronic pain is skyrocketing. And so it seems to be a symptom probably of a larger societal problem rather than a personal one. And I think, yeah, to repeat what I wanted to say, what I really wanted to do with this book was just sort of, yeah, raise awareness for other people, but also, even though I had gone through this chronic pain journey and figured out my own stuff and come out the other side as a writer, and as a writer who'd already published a book and then had that perceived failure, I needed to honor this story. And I felt like there was a story sitting in my gut that if I wasn't able to articulate, it gets a bit meta, but essentially what I felt and found was that there was, writing this book, there was a character named Oliver who was more or less me, but not me by proxy of him being a character in a book. And if I wasn't able to continue building the world around him, if I wasn't able to continue creating the hallways that he needed to walk through and the parks that he needed to walk through, then this character, this smaller version, perhaps the boy in me, would be trapped in this narrative while I had gotten out. And so it became a case of saving that character's life, which would in turn save me as an artist's life. And so a friend said to me not so long ago, he's like, it felt reading this book like you were writing for your life. And in many ways, like it was. Yeah.
I want to talk about, to kind of get to the other side of this, because of course it's called Train Lord, and so much of the book talks about you finding your way into the Sydney train system as a physical and kind of intellectual way out. So let's go there, back to train school, and you were going to read this passage about being surrounded by other people who are also in train school.
I suppose we all came to the job for our own reasons. Some had been school teachers, mechanics, pilots, doctors. Others had worked in security, in the army, in corporate finance. I remember one morning during train school, our teacher asked us why we had joined the railway. I was sick of busting my ass for fuck all pay. I was sick of doing overtime for free. I was sick of sitting at a desk. I hated my boss. People treated me like shit. I felt stuck. I was sick of the commute, of patience, of coworkers. I wanted change, more money, more holidays. I wanted something different, to be better, stable. I wanted regularity, structure. I wanted to belong.
Yeah, so I wanted to go here because there's like a very practical side to train school. You know, you learn, as you say, procedures for opening windows, climbing ladders, wearing backpacks. And there's also a more philosophical side. You write, we learn to slow down, to not think, or to think only about what we had learned. We learn how to stop. And then you write, I remembered how to breathe. Can you tell us about these two sides for you of train school? The very practical, you know, timetable side, wearing uniform side, and then this kind of mind clearing side.
Also, I just want to say, like, you know, in hindsight, obviously it seems like the perfect narrative, right? Like I was in a migraine, and then you get on the train and you're going around and around, but you're not going anywhere, and you're trying to figure out your life. Like, that was not the case at all. Basically, after I had, I would say, partially recovered through a Band-Aid sort of solution of some sort of physical therapy, I literally returned to Sydney jobless without any money, and I just took 2 painkillers and Googled no experience full-time Sydney, and a job on the railway came up as a train guard. And for those of you not from Australia, like this is like 40,000 people apply every year to get this job. There's like 20 jobs. It's like 100K a year government job. They call it golden handcuffs because once you get it, you would never leave. You know, you got the odd suicide on the network, but largely it's pretty relaxed. And so, yeah, essentially I went through train school for 5 months. So you got to learn every station in order, every stop signal. Like it's, my sister's a doctor, and we're talking about her medicine stuff, and I was telling her about the sheer amount of memorization I had to do, and she was like, that's more than I've got to do, which is probably a lie because she's very humble. But yeah, so, you know, it was really interesting too, because it's a job that, you know, you're meeting people as old as 83 to as young as 18, and like I said, people from all different walks of life. And like, yeah, everyone's there for their own specific reasons. And I think everyone comes there because something hasn't worked out. So it's again, returning to this idea of failure, but failure being, you know, you've also kind of won the lottery again. And like, so failure in the sense that you've been working a job or living a life that hasn't worked, and then you've come to this out of necessity usually, and you've been lucky enough to get it. And yeah, I, having been a writer for you know, almost 8 or 9 years at that point, and living largely, I suppose, week to week on freelance and a very, very small first book advance. This was, and you know, for those people that would have these jobs, I'd never had a job where you got like a regular paycheck. Also, forced sobriety was huge, and I mean it. Like, you know, you got drug and alcohol tested quite regularly. That was, yeah, for my mental health, like that was huge, as well as the regular paycheck, and then you knew where you're having your lunch break, you knew where you were having your when you were starting, when you were finishing. Like you became a cog in the system, which, you know, a lot of people don't like, but for me it was perfect. Like I had enough going on in my own head to think about, and I just needed the space again to stop and slow down. And essentially, basically what's for me interesting about this book is a lot of it's written in these quite short chapters, and they're a response to the railway, because I started writing in pencil and in pen on the backs of train diagrams beneath stations. So each station you got about 2 minutes, so that was all my capacity was to write at that point without triggering pain again. And so I'd just sit and I would try to start sketching these memories of this thing, of this migraine, and trying to piece together something that I didn't understand, trying to make sense of that, something like that.
There's also, you know, your descriptions of what's happening. So, I mean, maybe the job itself is highly sought after and it's, you know, stable, etc. But around you, there's, you know, fights. I'm paraphrasing here: fights, spitting, pissing, shitting, masturbating, screaming children, disgruntled members of the public coming up to you and saying, "Fuck you, your network is a piece of shit." Suicides, you know, so it's not, I mean, it's real life. It's not. Tell us about that. I mean, tell us about that side of I guess, right, you know, finding pockets of creativity, but also cleaning up someone's vomit in the corner of the train.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, like, I mean, on my first shift there was a suicide, so it was just like straight into it, and basically I didn't see it, but I had to go relieve the person. So, you know, having had my own sort of suicide scare, it was like in some ways it was a beautiful synchronicity, because what I you know, I'm not proud of it, but, and again, it was like I didn't want to kill myself because I was depressed, but it wasn't that I wanted to die. I just needed the pain to end, and no one could help. But that's a different story, and you can read about it. But basically, like with the with the you know, on that first shift, and so, you know, you taken out in a taxi, you relieve the person, you see the body kind of come by you with the white cloth draped over it, and it's like, yeah, you're in real life around all these people. And while there was a lot of, you know, I had a guard friend who he was like, yeah, mate, yeah, just actually, yeah, just 2 hours ago, this guy, he looked at me, he tried to stab me with a needle, and I grabbed the thing on the train that you can hold onto, and he drop kicked him out the door. Real life, you know. But there was so much beauty to be found there too. Like, I still remember there was this father and son, his disabled son, and every Sunday, his son loved trains, obsessed with them, and every Sunday he would take his disabled son out, and they would just ride the railway network. And he was like, you know what? It's his favorite thing, so it's my favorite thing too. And it almost made me like bawl my eyes out. And you know, he became a regular, and so because I got to do the announcements as well over the trains, and so I'd say hi to him, and it was, yeah, it's one of my mentors, who's a Australian writer named Amanda Lowry, and she says, you know, like the railway it's the great leveler. It's people from all walks of life in every single different situation mostly will ride the train. And of course, within that, there's going to be your vomiters and shitters and whatever, but there's also going to be like unfathomable beauty to be seen there. And I think, yeah, for me, it was like personally beautiful, because I was able to carve out a space for myself to grow and learn about my relationship with my body ostensibly, but also to view more largely humanity's greater beauty and humanity's humor. And yeah, I used to do these funny announcements where I'd like tell dad jokes, and I'd say like, attention customers, next stop is Rockdale, named after Dwayne the Rock Johnson. It's good. People laughed, and then they'd like they'd walk past your window, and they'd, you know, they'd give you like a hooroo or something, and you don't know what they're going through. Maybe that saved them in some capacity. I don't know.
And did you feel like you had a network of other train guards? I mean, what did they make of you as a former writer, as you know, you're writing in your lunch break? Were they wary of you? Did they feel like that they the sense that they were going to find their way into your book?
I largely didn't talk, like I didn't tell many people, because I guess like you're in your train school, and then you go and then you get like you're in TCAC, they call it, but it's like the central, you're either at Central or you're out at Auburn or you're wherever. And largely like, I made like one or two friends, but really I wasn't really there to make friends, kind of. Like I was there to figure my own stuff out. And so yeah, I mean, also you're doing shift work, right? Like you're up at 10 a.m. Sorry, 10. You start your shift at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., 2 a.m., whatever, and then you're gonna do like 8 of those in a row. So then you work till 9 in the morning or something, and then that's the other thing, because it is a pretty isolating. So okay, sometimes you're in the big meeting room with all the people like hanging around, but 8 hours of the day mainly you're just in a little like 1 by 1 meter carriage just doing your funny announcement if you want. And for a lot of people on the trains as well, that isolation can get to like depression is big on the network. It can be big on the network. So yeah, I made a few friends, but yeah, largely I kind of was more interested in thinking about what this book might be and trying to sketch out structures and sentences, and then when the pain would return, just going up to the sleeping room and just closing my eyes and meditating and that kind of thing. Yeah.
There's this lovely doubling, as so much doubling that happens, but one of the doubling things and it leads us into you basically trying to find a form, trying to find your voice again, writing the story, is the sense of around you trains having their own stories, whether they're being reported about in the newspaper or people on the network telling the stories, or as you say, and this is such a beautiful sentence, you say, but most of all, I'm not telling you how sometimes if you're paying attention, if you're really listening, the trains will tell their own stories. So there are kind of just stories everywhere as you're working through your own life story.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to, again, it's the personal becoming universal, which as a writer and understanding, we're beginning to understand and hopefully getting better at them, how stories work. Things need beginnings, middles, and ends, but I also know that stories work really well when you're able to do the personal becoming universal. And inherently on the network, I think, when you do hear, whether it's the guy drop kicking someone out of the door, or we had a train driver who used to pretend to be blind, so he'd put on these really dark glasses and get a cane, and he'd like hobble up the platform, and people would like watch him like trying to key into the door, and he's like, hey, I'm just fucking with you. But like equally, you have, I mean, I don't want to go into it too much, but yeah, that there were like, I guess what I would say is that I was just one person working for the railway, trying to figure out my own story. And that on each train, you've got 2,000 to 3,000 people doing exactly the same thing. And like, that was never lost on me that, I make a joke about it, I told these jokes, but I think I was doing it as much for myself as I was for other people to have a break, be able to just have a laugh and relax and not, because everyone, I do this other thing where I'd say, well, to preface this, like we call in Australia kissing pashing. So I'd say, attention customers, next stop is Ashfield, but for all you singles out there, we call it Pashfield. And then I'd tell everyone to make out. And I want you to make out. And then I'd say, oh, I'm just kidding, or am I? And everyone would be like, oh, it's so funny. But then you'd see people put down their phones, whatever, and they just start laughing and talking to the people next to them. And it's like, again, this idea of community that in those very communal spaces is lacking a lot of the time. There was something quite special around watching those interactions happen, where people who might not have spoken or talked suddenly, shattered their personal space and just reached out to a stranger and shared a moment. I really think there's something quite beautiful about that.
So you're watching these stories around you, you're hearing these train stories, and then this story itself slowly starts to coalesce and come together in some ways. Can you tell us about that process, how you move from writing on the back of these train schedules to this book as it is now published, you know, readable, sellable, etc. In the book, you talk a lot about the kind of type of story and also the form of the story. You mentioned this idea of like the migraine as a strong sun, the nucleus. In the book, you say it's a love story, it's a trust story. You say, let me be clear, this is not a happy story. And all, you know, you mentioned also that there's this kind of smaller Oliver self in the book. And there's an opening quote. You cite Paul Bowles from an exemplary essay. He says, to discuss oneself is to invite disaster. Never give an interview, never, under any conditions, write the story of your life.
Yeah, I mean, he's a genius, right? Yeah. I mean, I love Paul Bowles, and I think, yeah, it's a tongue-in-cheek thing to do because he does it all the time, and I guess I do it too. And you need a little bit of disaster in your life, otherwise you're going to be very boring. But I think, yeah, how this basically, I had made a decision that I was going to quit the railway, which everyone around me thought was absurd. Like, they're like, you're going to make the worst decision of your life. Like, you're on house money here in a few years. Like, why would you? But I needed to tell this. For me, like I said, it was like in my gut. I had to do it. And I was too close to it in Sydney. I had to go away. So I'd saved 25 grand, which was by far more money than I'd ever had in my life. And I decided that I was going to move to Spain. I had a friend in Barcelona and he'd been telling me to come. And so I took that 25 grand because I kind of knew as well that like no publishers wanted to know about me. No grants I'd had my shot and it was done. But I had this chunk of money that I was like, I'm going to invest in myself. I'm going to spend every last cent trying to get this story from, again, like this idea of translation from the brain to the page. And so I moved to, Barcelona, but I sort of mucked up my visa. So I could only stay for 3 months. And I'd written maybe like one or two of the first 2 chapters, something like that. Actually, something really interesting happened as well. I don't know if you've ever had this, but I think when you go all in on something, sometimes if you're lucky enough, certain events of synchronicity start occurring. And before I'd left Sydney, I used to go to this library in Double Bay, and I was really interested in dreams. I was having these kind of weird dreams, like maybe almost nightmares. And I got this book, and in the middle of this dreams book was a bookmark that said Biblioteca de Catalunya, and I'd already booked my flight to Barcelona. So I'm like holding a bookmark from the place I'm going to go in a dreams book, which, you know, all right, a little bit weird, but whatever. Got to Barcelona, and at the time I'd been reading lots of Roberto Bolaño, and I was really intensely interested in him. And I was living in Raval in Carrer del Carme, and again, having another minor breakdown of not knowing how to write, not knowing how to do it. I was like, well, I wonder where this bookmark is from. I just wanted to know. And so I typed into Google this bookmark, and it turned out to be literally across the street from my house. Like, it was 50 meters away in this old library that used to be a hospital. And so I'm sitting on the steps reading Bolaño, and then I'm like, I wonder where Bolaño lived and wrote in Barcelona. I went in this deep dive, found an address, typed it into Google, and then I start walking, and I'm kind of walking to what eventually turns out to be the exact same cafe I've been going to every day to write this book. And on the other side, there's a plaque that said Roberto Bolaño used to live like on the floor above. And it felt like, you know, I'd spent half my money. I had like a tenth of a book. I'd really gone all in. I had no backup plan again, but there was this, you know, whether you believe in that stuff or not, for me, it was enough to think, okay, there's something here that says you're on the right path. And essentially I left and then moved to Albania because I needed to get outside of the EU. So I lived there for, about a month in a tent on a beach, where I wrote the Jep chapter, which was one of my favorite ones. And then I ended up in Georgia because I didn't want to go home, and at that point they used to give it like a free bottle of wine on entry to get into the country. They invented wine, and they also, I was interested in hiking in the mountains and stuff. So essentially, to cut a long story short, was that I ended up there, and then COVID hit, and then I returned to Australia. But I'd also found an agent somehow, because no agents wanted me, but this guy John Connell, who's an Irish writer, and for one more coincidence, I'd been in Western Sydney at like 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, and John had moved back to Ireland and written a book called The Cow Book, which became a bestseller in Ireland and in America. And then I just hear this voice, this Irish voice, and I was like, John. He's like, "I'm Oliver, and how are you there, boyo?" I was like, "What are you even doing here?" And then he said, "Well, I'm just here on tour and blah blah blah." And then, "How's your book going then?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I'm writing on the back of a train diagram. I don't know." He's like, "Well, when you get enough done, why don't you send it to me?" And so we tried to find every agent under the sun. No one wanted to know about it. And then I asked him, "Well, who's your agent?" And he's like, "I don't mean to be funny, but just a little bit out of your league." I was like, "Just send it to her." And then she loved it after 10 pages, and then the rest is history. So yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned so you mentioned this kind of physical distance, like in order to start writing it, you have to move away. There's also, as you mentioned, kind of literary distance in the sense of creating this character because you yourself have moved on, but you want to rectify this story and from a literary sense. So you write, "I felt too close to the work. I needed something, a buffer, distant space where we could roam, not as people, but characters." And there's also temporal distance. You write, "At the time, that phase angered me, seemed inconceivable, but now, nearly 6 years on, I think maybe I'm beginning to understand." In other words, you had to move away from this story in so many different ways.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think a lot of people who have gone through something that, almost ends your life. It's a thing that you need to, if you want to write anything meaningful about it, what was interesting to me as well is, there's a chapter in there where I started writing it shortly after I stopped having pain for the first time, but again, it was a Band-Aid solution, and I was, my mother, I returned to Brisbane, and we would sit in front of a computer, and she would essentially hold my hand, and we'd learn how to, I couldn't even sit for a start, let alone look at a computer. So we were learning how to do these things again, and to retrain neural pathways, and to, be comfortable in normal situations. And at that point, I'd started very basically this story, but I had no idea why it was relevant. I didn't know it was a story about, I was interested in in my first love when I was 8 years old with a girl named Melanie, and I didn't know why that was interesting, but I knew there was an energy there. And I tried and I tried and I tried for months to craft this story, and I got some of it done, but I shelved it, and it stayed over there. And then it's like 6 years later, after I'd gotten about halfway through the book, I knew that the emotions that I could elicit in that story, again, the migraine being so unknowable and so beyond description, I knew that if I could use fiction, I wanted to use nonfiction, I wanted to use fiction, I wanted to hit it at all angles. So I tell this story about Melanie, about us being young, about us falling in love, and then I say something where the story ends quite shockingly, and it gets you in the gut. And then the next chapter I start and I say, well, that wasn't true. And so it's a huge risk to take as a writer writing a nonfiction book about something as serious as this, to basically say that you've lied. But I knew that if I could pull off what I wanted to, which was to then write another version of that where, Melanie's wearing makeup to school and we're in love and she kisses me and everyone's teasing us. And then I hear like some of her friends calling her like a whore and a slut, but I'm not courageous enough to approach them. And so Melanie goes home from school, and I want to apologize to her. I want to say like, sorry for not being courageous. And I go there, and then I see her dad, and her dad's crying, and I realize that I go upstairs, and Melanie says that her mum's died, and the reason she's worn makeup to school is not for me, but because it was her mum's makeup, and she wanted to keep her mother alive. And then it goes into something like, my dad asked me like, well, why can't you tell funny, happy stories. I remember when you wrote these children's stories that were happy, and essentially what I was trying to do with those first two stories was shine a light back on the whole text by saying, I can make you feel that. Maybe I can make you cry. Maybe I can make you feel guilt. Maybe I can make you feel shame. Maybe I can make you feel something. And even though I can't make you understand the migraine using those fictional techniques, I can make you understand something like what the migraine was like. So trying to use storytelling as a meta way to focus back on my experience, which felt untranslatable.
Yeah, so much of throughout the book, there are all these, as you say, kind of fragments, paragraphs, where you're basically meditating on what does it mean to write? What does it mean to write fiction, non-fiction, tell the truth, tell lies, create? You write, understand this, stories are miracles. We live and breathe inside them, and they live and breathe inside us. And we take all the mysterious and spectacular and impossible things that ever happened, and they make us new.
Yeah, I really believe that. Yeah.
Before we go to your to read this last section, another kind of meditation on what is it, what are stories. You talk kind of consciously in the book about how this story, you know, in your life as you write it here with truth and non-truth, it kind of has you in its thrall, in the sense of you want to write it, you want to be released from it, but every time you go to write it, it keeps you kind of part of it. You say, I'm obsessed with this narrative, this pain, I need to let go of it, but I don't know how, because you've known the pain for so long, you don't know who you are as an artist, as a person without it. And the other thing, of course, is it's not as if, and you say this too in the book, that once you've written the book, the pain goes away. So can you talk about wanting to kind of tie all the loose ends up about this time period, but also wanting to move on from it? And now here we are still talking about it. So how do you feel like you've found release?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember finishing the book and it really felt like something had profoundly shifted, and even writing the scene in the book where I eventually see a psychotherapist and lots of things happen, but revisiting that in the narrative and then writing about it was almost like a parallel release to what that thing was. And I think, you know, the thing about chronic pain is it's, like we said, boredom, and it's continual cycle of repetitive, you don't know if it's coming, you don't know if it's going, blah blah blah. And I think to be able to finally put that experience between, to make it tangible and external, and to ultimately love it, I think that's huge. Learn how to love that narrative and learn how to love yourself in many ways, which I hadn't fully, probably in the same way that I do now, been able to do. Like, I had to write it to be able to do that. And I think, yeah, now, I mean, yeah, that book, I wrote that book, I can't even remember now, like in 2019 or 20 or something. So, and such is the life of publication cycles that you have to, and I'm also performing at Edinburgh Fringe, so I'll be reliving it again in very real times. But I think, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but to yes, like I feel like I was able to honor that experience. I was hopefully able to translate in the best way I knew how that experience, and hopefully make people think not so much about me ultimately, but the other people in their lives who might also be like suffering. And yeah, and yeah, the idea that ultimately, like, the stories you tell yourselves are the ones that become true, I think is like a really important thing. Yeah.
Will you read this last paragraph for us?
This is from a chapter called Ghosts. But we can never quit stories, not really, not while we're alive. We can only see them for what they are, flashes of light and pain and laughter that travel at breakneck speed from our bodies to our heads, that color all the fucked up and beautiful things that have ever happened. Ultimately, stories are not for truth. They are for magic and alchemy and waking in the middle of the night and second guessing. They are for editing and rearranging and talking back. They are bridges to the places that no longer or never existed. And the only reason I'm still writing is because I believe, however childlike, that there might be something on the other side.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please? Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I will refer you to Emily and the microphone.
So out of the 40,000 people who apply for this job, how did you end up being one of the 20 who got chosen?
I don't know, because you had to go through 5 rounds of interviews, a psych evaluation, role plays, multiple tests. It was a 3-month interview process before you even got to the 5 months of or 6 months of train school before you even started the job. So I can only put it down to, again, either like divine intervention or maybe like I was working at the Opera House as an usher. So that was also a government job, but they wanted people who could deal with people, I guess, because of all the bizarre and horrific things that can happen. And maybe they thought he'll do.
Other questions? Yes. It's for Zoom. You need to use the microphone.
So are they're gone? They're gone.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
Now, did people think you were crazy?
I think a lot of doctors.
Did they went because they couldn't find anything that made sense to them?
Yeah, there were no tests that would, you get all the brain scans and you get all the blood tests and you get, everything under the sun, and there's no diagnosis. And so it kind of becomes like you question your sanity, they question your sanity. It's a
Yeah.
terrible spiral.
I
but,
can imagine. I'm so happy that you're well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're just well.
Thank you.
Other questions?
And if you want to know more about how I did heal the migraines, it's in there, but essentially, yeah, kind of comes down to being okay with stress and neural pathway, reimagining sort of your neural pathways. And if you want to come see me after, there's like a lot of literature and podcasts and books that I use and still use, because it's not as if I've just magic bulleted it. But the difference now is when I feel these things come on, I don't freak out because I have the tools. I know how to fix it. And a lot of people around the world are, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but in my case and for some people's cases, that's the reality now.
Two questions. So one, were you afraid of conjuring the migraine while writing about it, or was it a way to keep it at bay?
I mean, it did come back several times, while writing it. But I mean, again, like I knew what to do, which you remember eventually when you stop freaking out. But also on some other level, I don't want to say I was grateful for it, but I was like, oh yeah, because after pain is something that it happens and generally it leaves, which is different to chronic pain. But it's like you get cold or you break a leg or something, and eventually those things heal. And when you look back on that time, it's like, well, that happened, but you don't remember what was so tragic and terrible about it. And maybe the same thing kind of happened with my heads. I was like, well, I know this thing happened that changed my life profoundly, but so then when I was writing, it did come back. I was like, oh, okay. And I was able to kind of step back into those rooms and try and describe as best as I could what they were. But thankfully they went away too. So yeah.
And then you made me think of Anne Patchett composing novels in her head when she was waiting tables before she became, a world famous writer. So do you compose in your head, did you, when you were doing that work, or did you wait until you could step away to write in those spurts?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I had composed any of it in my head, but I did, I do remember, we said it before, but we called it like the before. And so I would travel to these places that did and did not existed, which you might call memory or you might call fiction. And I would kind of live these other lives, because if you're just lying there for 12 hours a day, you got to do something. And so I found that quite interesting. And even, I don't know if you're familiar with the Australian author Gerald Murnane, but he, in his own fictions, travels to the outer regions and what he calls the plains and the borderlands of his own mind while describing those sort of realities. And I thought there was like an interesting, not that I'm Gerald Murnane because he's probably the greatest living English writer in the English language, but there was something quite interesting about, again, the breakdown of fiction and nonfiction, and potentially, like he says, everything that he writes should be called an essay, which literally just means to try. There doesn't need to be this dichotomy. It's just you're trying to tell your story as truthful as possible. And so, perhaps I did plan a few things that I wasn't even aware of at that time that eventually I was able to sift through and find, maybe. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yep.
I was wondering what your favorite stop on the Sydney train network was, and also what your relationship or what your experience working in that job makes you feel about the Paris Metro.
Yeah, good. I had two. I really liked Bondi Junction, because sometimes if you were like, you're technically meant to kind of stay on for an hour or two, but you generally know after a certain hour, even in the afternoons, like someone's going to take over you. And barring some huge emergency, I kind of learned how to like just slip out of the system, and then I'd go down to the beach. So I really like that one. And then Waterfall was really cool because it was right near the national park, and you really got out of Sydney, and it was rainforest all around. And they always told us, because you still had to manually what is it, like shunt the trains, like change the track from one to the other. Not shunt, what is it called when you switch the points, change the points. And you had to do it still manually, and you just knew, like, obviously the train's gotta like not be on the track when you do it. And this guy, like, twice in 2 weeks just completely derailed these trains by changing. It was a total nightmare, but those are the kind of stories I was after. It was great. And Paris Metro, big fan. But what I love about Paris is it's so walkable. It's great. Or cyclable. I just cycle everywhere. It's brilliant. But yeah, straight on the metro wherever I need, generally, if it's too cold.
When you say you're performing at Fringe Festival, what's the difference between the book and the performance?
So that's my girlfriend everywhere.
Subtle promo.
So yeah, I turned this book into a stage show that I did at Adelaide Fringe and at Sydney Fringe, and I'd never really done a show or studied theatre, but I kind of had an idea of, when I was writing, I'd listen to the same songs over and over, and I felt like if I did that, then performing over that would make sense. And so somehow I won an award at the Adelaide Fringe, and then I sold out the Sydney one, and so now I'm going to do it at Edinburgh Fringe and hope the humor translates there. But yeah, I guess I take a chunk and I remix it and I make it small. And for me, again, I've written this book, someone takes it, they buy it, they read it, there's a disconnect. And while it's like we both meet in this space where you're in our imaginations or something, but there's something really rewarding about performing the live show, because you get to see instantly jokes hitting, is the sadness hitting, is the tensions right. And the most interesting thing for me is that, okay, I guess like generally I would say this book is for, like, I would have thought for a young audience, but in reality, the amount of times that I've finished a show and then there's been a 75-year-old Aussie male who's never talking about their feelings in their life, and he's like, "Oh mate, I've had some back pain for the past 30 years and I'm going to tell you about it." And but it's really beautiful because like he's probably never had that opportunity or something. So yeah, it extends the conversation. It opens up something larger, I think, that I find interesting. And yeah, again, if like I've done my job, the story it's not really about me, it's about other people and their relationship with other people who have chronic pain in their body. So yeah.
Two questions. When you talk about suicide, is that like people throwing themselves on the track? Does that happen?
About one a day,
Really?
statistically.
Okay. Second question. Does Australia have, and did you ride sort of like really long haul things from Sydney to Perth, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we've got like the GAN that goes up to, I think it's from like Sydney to up through Alice Springs and then up to Darwin, yeah, and then we've got the one that goes across to Perth, Sydney to Perth, like along the Nullarbor, I think. I never got to do it. We actually got really cheap tickets if you wanted to do it, but because you're working 13-day fortnights, 13 out of 14 days, and you get like 5 weeks holiday. But by that stage, I was wanting to go and do other things. And they also, yeah, they cost something like $4,000 a trip. Like they're really expensive. They're not, cheap anymore. But yeah, would have loved to. Would still love to. Yeah.
Last questions? Yes.
Largely wonderful, to be honest, because I returned home. I had no money left again, and so I moved in with my parents, and then entered into a very like monk almost like state where I woke up every morning at like 8. Me and mum would Wim Hof breathe, meditate, future journal, make breakfast, and then I would write from about 12 till 4. I was training for a half marathon. I'd go for a run. I'd swim in the ocean, come home, make dinner, and then be in bed by 10. And I just did that every day for 3 months. So that was, yeah, actually like probably the most prolific I've been creatively speaking. And then, yeah, within that time, I got my grant that would take me to Georgia and I sold my book. So it was like, whoa, okay, we're good.
Last questions? Yes.
When you feel the pain sort of coming on, do you use it as a force for renewal or motivation or some other way to make it into something positive?
Yeah, I mean, I always know now that my body's trying to talk to me. I know that it's trying to say something in some way that I'm not listening to. And often I'm like, yeah, I'm like, I would say unconsciously suppressing rage or guilt, or I'm not allowing there's something that I can feel that I'm not addressing. And rather than constrict and become tight and closed, I just, in every capacity, just think about opening and feeling. And again, realizing that like the body isn't the enemy. It's just trying to talk to you in any way that it knows how. And often if I listen to it and I sit in those uncomfortable spaces, and again, it sounds silly, but it shouldn't sound silly, but I just remind myself that I love myself and that I have my own back. And yeah, sometimes you have to do further like writing work or something, but instead of it being a terrifying experience that I think is going to negatively impact my life and I go to war on myself, I go the complete opposite way. And I ask it like a dear friend, like, hey, what's up? What's happening?